going to talk you through the last part of this blog article and series of code, and we're going to demonstrate the blog articles on the page as a component and talk through some of the things that I'm going to be doing here. So first thing, I was going to turn off Grammarly because that often gets in the way. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that I have a nice title, recommended blog topics for you. And as you can see, it's starting to pull through a list here. So let's go and pull that apart. So the first thing I'm going to do, which is API keys removed, I'm going to walk you through some of the changes to the code here. So you can go through and analyze this code and send me a request if you'd like a copy of it. But there's a few things that I have done here. So let's just point out. So I've converted over to V1 chat completions API endpoint. And what this does is this allows me to model what you would have seen in the playground here. So that's essentially this, kind of API modeled in here. And what I'm going to do is in the code show you a couple of things. So bear with me. The first thing that we have done here is you'll notice that we have changed the request payload and the messages that are going in. So firstly, we are defining the model, GPT-3.5 Turbo. And I have created an array here of messages, which when you graduate to the chat API, if you remember from previous articles, we talk about this system role here. So the system role is highlighted when you jump over to the playground. That jumps to this section here, and that's the user message. And of course, the assistant is the response. Now you can pass in your own assistant response messages. Just think about that for a minute. And the reason why you do that is to give the bot a rough idea of what response you're sort of expecting. I've not explored that in this article. It does give mixed responses, and in the documentation it also says that it is the API and the model, the system is designed to ignore that if it feels that it can provide a better response. So jumping back into the code. So I've created a system message that says you are a larrikin who uses slang when speaking. I've kept that nice and short to try and keep my tokens down and try and reduce my spend on the API. Talk about that in another article. And then I've got my role user and I'm taking hard-coded input. You'll see that I've left the comment, replace this string with your session variable. Ultimately, I do have session available to me in this application here. If I scroll up, you can see that I'm bringing in require auth here from my library. I am bringing in the session using require auth. And then from the session, I could paste in the variables in here. There's only two reasons why I haven't done it. I haven't got all of the bio information pulled in from the social networks yet into my database, although the fields are there. And I'm running out of time in terms of how we pull this application together. So there are plenty of examples in this application here for session. I think I did have one just here. Here we go. So for example, you can bring in session user image. And if you have a look at the autocomplete on this object, you can see that I've got 5 different fields typed out there already. So that would be a case of putting in, whatever you see fit from a social media and bio perspective. So I've got my message response all set up here. And then what I'm going to do is just jump up to a couple of things that I did whilst I was prototyping. So in useEffect, which is essentially the system in React and Next that handles the request and the delivery of the data to the DOM and controls the loading state that I have here. You can see that I'm punting out the response into the log, and you can also see here that I am a little bit further down here. I'm actually logging out my request. One of the things I was experiencing as I was moving from the completions API to the chat completions is malformed responses. And so I was using that in the application here. And you can see that actually then, punts out my JSON request here. And that was allowing me to just troubleshoot where I had issues with malformed JSON going into the arrays. So if I jump back in here, there's a couple of other things that I have done. Inside Next.js, you can essentially create states, and those states are, for example, I have loading, set loading, and that is my loading state added to my component. And then I was able to come down here and say, if it is loading, show skeleton rendering. I'll show you this in a moment. So this is basically blobs of Tailwind CSS that are configured to look like a component. And then if it's not loading state, in other words, the response is completed, then output my content here. I did modify the layout a little bit up here, so I just changed the order of these items and just put in a few breaking spaces in there. And I think that's pretty much all I did. This code, of course, is not clean. You would want to, make the error handling a little bit better. You would probably want to pull this out into its own block of code to build up the session variables, and that's ultimately where in here you might go. You would take this block here. And that's where you would basically put in the session variables in here. So, session.user.bio, and you'd probably want to put a whole bunch of handling in here and all sorts of wonderful things. But that's ultimately where you're going to build up the array. So I'll just undo that for now. And just come back to here. I'm just going to leave that as is. So what I'll do is I'll just pull this off of the screen here. I'm going to put the API key back in. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to reload my application. I'm going to clear the console, and I'm going to show you how my application is working. So I'm going to jump back to the all posts here. Let me just close that. I'm going to click on new post. And as you can see, my skeleton loader is showing in the top of the screen here. And you can now see that it has rendered. Now, one thing that's really interesting with the way that this works is use effect when running in React development mode runs twice. I am not skilled enough to understand why that is. I have read some very interesting documentation from Next.js on that. So one of the things that's interesting is how that's now actually outputting extra text in my response there. So I need to sort of think about why that's happening. It appears to be a dev-only issue and wouldn't happen in production. But one of the things that's interesting is how the response, once it loads the second time, is then adding extra text in. It appears to be intermittent, and when I turn when I turn Next into production mode, it does go away. But that's something I would add to my list to look at. Either way, I have a nice list here. Now, one of the things that I'm just going to jump into quickly is the way that I'm actually rendering and styling the component. So one of the things I noticed is that the responses coming back from the API are ultimately just a string. So there are libraries out there that you can use to interpret, lumps of plain, non-styled text. One of the quick and dirty ways to handle bullet points and spacing is to use text areas as an input box for styling. Not super clean and probably has some accessibility issues, but that's the reason why I use text area auto resize. It had a whole bunch of classing and styling and other wonderful things that I could put in there. You can see I've got the placeholder and the value. It's disabled by default, but what it does allow me to do is to easily let the user copy that content out using, Control V, Control C, and the DOM. HTML objects are not getting in the way. So a couple of things I would do, obviously clean up my rendering of my request and my responses into the DOM there, because that's not a great idea, having these constantly pumped out. I may want to put those into some type of into some type of logging solution, and so on and so on. Other features I could add is a button that says use this title. On click, it grabs item number 1 and it automatically populates the blog post. But I just wanted to show you how you can integrate the AI model directly into your app. Thanks for your time.